In the autumn mists of 1872, deep within the forgotten hollows of the Ozark Mountains, silence had a different quality. It swallowed screams, buried secrets beneath wet limestone and rotting leaves. Here in Blackwood Flats, the Lawson family had built their world apart from civilization, apart from God's watchful eye. For 14 years, neighbors whispered of strange sounds from their compound, of visitors who never left, of prosperity that made no sense. What neighbors never imagined was that the Lawsons had discovered the most efficient livestock, not cattle, not swine. Human beings bred like animals for a single, nauseating purpose. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and how you came across this video. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. This was not a crime. This was an operation that fed on human lives for decades. To understand how such horror could flourish undetected, you must first understand the land itself. The Ozark Mountains rise from the earth like ancient teeth, their limestone bones weathered by countless centuries of rain and wind. These are not the gentle rolling hills of pastoral America, but something older, more primal. Dense forests of oak and hickory stretch endlessly across ridges that seem to fold in upon themselves, creating hollows so deep that sunlight barely penetrates their depths. In the heart of this wilderness lay Hazel County, a place so remote that most maps of the era simply marked it as blank space. The county seat of Gaspard's Landing was little more than a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a muddy crossroads where the mail came twice a month if the weather held. But even Gaspard's Landing seemed like a bustling metropolis compared to what lay beyond the northern ridge. Blackwood Flats occupied a valley so hidden that travelers could pass within a mile of it and never know it existed. The only access was a treacherous wagon trail that wound down through a narrow gap in the limestone cliffs, a passage locals called Devil's Throat. After heavy rains, which came often in these mountains, the trail became a river of mud that could swallow a horse and rider whole. In winter, ice made it impassable for months at a time. The valley itself stretched for perhaps 3 miles, carved out by an ancient creek that still gurgled somewhere beneath the surface. Mist hung perpetually in the air, rising from underground springs that fed a network of limestone caves honeycombing the earth below. The trees grew thick and strange here, their trunks twisted by the constant dampness into shapes that seemed to watch and whisper. Spanish moss, rare this far north, draped from the branches like funeral shrouds. At the valley's heart sat the Lawson compound, built where the underground creek emerged briefly into daylight before vanishing again into the caves. The main house was a sprawling structure of logs and fieldstone, its windows small and deep-set like suspicious eyes. Behind it stood a massive tannery, its water wheel turning endlessly in the stream, grinding out a rhythm that echoed off the valley walls like a giant's heartbeat. But it was what lay beneath that made Blackwood Flats truly unique. The limestone caves extended for miles in every direction, creating a hidden world of chambers and passages known only to the Lawsons. Some said these caves connected to similar networks throughout the Ozarks, allowing travel across hundreds of miles without ever seeing the sun. Others whispered that the caves went deeper still, down to places where the earth's own darkness pooled like black water. The geography was perfect for secrets. Sound barely carried beyond the valley walls. Smoke from cooking fires dissipated in the perpetual mist. A man could scream himself hoarse and never be heard beyond the ridge. More importantly, a family could live entirely apart from the world, following their own laws, worshiping their own gods, feeding their own hungers. This was a world unto itself, ruled by one family for generations, a family whose origins were as murky as the hollows they called home. The Lawson family arrived in Blackwood Flats sometime in the 1840s, though no one could say exactly when or from where. They simply appeared one autumn, like mushrooms after rain, already established and prosperous in a way that defied explanation. While their neighbors scratched out meager livings from rocky soil and subsistence hunting, The Lawsons possessed wealth that seemed to flow from the very stones of their valley. Hezekiah Lawson stood as patriarch of this strange dynasty, a man whose pale eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had never been questioned. Tall and gaunt, with prematurely white hair that he wore long in the old fashion, he moved through his domain with the quiet authority of a king surveying his kingdom. Neighbors who encountered him on his rare trips to Gaspard's Landing described a man who spoke little but commanded absolute attention when he did. His voice carried the educated accent of the eastern cities, yet something in his manner suggested he had traveled much further than Boston or Philadelphia. Morwen Lawson, his wife, presented an even more unsettling figure. Where Hezekiah commanded through presence, Morwen disturbed through absence. She drifted through conversations like smoke, her pale hands always moving, always arranging something just so. The few women who had occasion to speak with her in town noted her ethereal beauty and perfect manners, but also something else, something they could never quite name. One merchant's wife later described it as the feeling of speaking to someone who was looking through you at something much more interesting, just beyond your shoulder. Their son Caleb embodied everything his parents kept hidden, a massive man with hands like ham hocks and a permanent stoop from ducking through doorways. He possessed the simple devotion of a faithful hound. Those who saw him working around the compound noted how he moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and how the family's servants seemed to shrink into themselves whenever he appeared. He spoke rarely and only when spoken to, but his pale eyes, so like his father's, missed nothing. The Lawson wealth manifested in ways both obvious and strange. Their compound boasted amenities that even the wealthy families of Little Rock would envy: imported furniture and fine china that must have cost fortunes to transport into the mountains. Yet they showed no interest in the usual markers of frontier prosperity. They kept no cattle, raised no crops, owned no lumber mill or mining operation. Their only visible business was the tannery, but the hides they processed seemed far too fine and numerous for what the local hunters could provide. More puzzling still were the people who served them. The Lawsons claimed to employ indentured servants, men and women working off debts in the traditional manner. But these servants presented a uniformity that troubled those who glimpsed them. They were invariably well-fed, almost plump, with pale skin and vacant expressions. They moved with the shuffling gait of sleepwalkers, performing their duties with mechanical precision. Most unsettling of all, they bore a striking resemblance to one another, as if they were all cousins, or, closer still, Sheriff Josiah Hale, the law in those parts, had received more than one inquiry about the Lawson operation over the years. Concerned citizens whispered about the number of people who seemed to live in that valley, far more than any normal household would require. But whenever the sheriff made his perfunctory visits to Blackwood Flats, he found everything in perfect order. The servants appeared healthy and content, the ledgers balanced, the operations entirely legal under the loose regulations of Reconstruction-era Arkansas. What the sheriff's ledger would later reveal was a different story entirely. Regular payments from one H. Lawson, marked simply as "for services and discretion," suggested that the family's legal status depended less on actual compliance and more on purchased blindness. The amounts were substantial, far more than a country sheriff's salary, enough to ensure that awkward questions remained unasked and disturbing observations went unrecorded. Their wealth bought silence until the autumn of 1872, when they sent a letter that would crack their world open. In the mountains, stories grow like ivy, creeping from house to house until they cover everything in shadow. The tales about the Lawsons began as whispers, fragments that emerged around flickering fires when darkness pressed close. The first story dated back to 1856, when hunter Tobias Crane followed a wounded buck into unfamiliar territory. Crane was known as a steady man, not given to drink or flights of fancy, which made what happened next all the more disturbing. He tracked the deer for hours through increasingly strange country until mist began to rise and he realized he had wandered into a hidden valley. As darkness fell, Crane found himself at the rim of an unknown settlement, Below him, lamplight flickered through windows, but it was not the sight that unnerved him, it was the sound. Rising from the valley came singing, if it could be called that. Voices raised in harmony, but not in any hymn he recognized. The melody was ancient and alien, rising and falling like wind through caves, seeming to come from every building at once. Crane later told anyone who would listen that the sound made his teeth ache and his vision blur. He stumbled backward from the ridge, abandoning his wounded deer, and spent the night huddled against a boulder, pressing his hands over his ears. When dawn came, he fled back toward town, but the melody followed him for miles. He never hunted those ridges again. When pressed for details, Crane would only shake his head and mutter about the singing from the smokehouse. Within a year, his hair had gone completely white. He died in 1864, found frozen in his cabin, with his hands still pressed over his ears. The second incident occurred 3 years later, when traveling peddler Samuel Wickham arrived in Gaspar's Landing with a story that left townspeople crossing themselves. Wickham claimed he had called at a prosperous compound in a hidden valley, hoping to sell his wares to what appeared to be a wealthy family. A woman had answered his knock, beautiful and pale, dressed in fine clothes that belonged in a St. Louis parlor rather than a mountain hollow. She had been perfectly polite, examining his goods with a discerning eye, but as their transaction progressed, Wickham became increasingly uneasy. It was her eyes, he later explained at Brennan's Tavern. They were the eyes of someone examining livestock, calculating yield and tenderness with the cold precision of a butcher selecting cuts for the smokehouse. When she smiled, which she did often, it never reached those pale, appraising eyes. Mrs. Agnes Pettigrew, the postmistress and keeper of local gossip, collected these stories like pressed flowers. She had dozens of them, fragments that painted a picture of something deeply wrong in the northern hollows. Travelers who claimed to smell cooking meat where no farms existed. Hunters who found strange markings carved into trees, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Most troubling were accounts of people who had simply vanished. Not the usual disappearances of unwary travelers, but something more systematic, a pattern stretching back years, all last seen heading toward the northern ridges, all described as healthy specimens who should have survived in the wilderness. These were just stories, the kind told to scare children on long winter nights. Mountain folk had always been suspicious of their neighbors, quick to attribute misfortune to witchcraft or devil worship. But for one man, these whispered warnings were about to become a terrifying reality. Reverend Elias Thorne arrived in Arkansas in spring of 1872 with little more than a worn Bible and desperate need for redemption. At 28, he had already buried one ministry in disgrace, though the exact nature of his fall remained carefully guarded. What mattered now was his burning desire to prove himself worthy of God's forgiveness. Thorne had been a rising star in the Presbyterian Church of St. Louis, but a scandal involving a parishioner's wife had ended his career. The church hierarchy had quietly arranged his transfer to the Arkansas wilderness, where damaged reputations went to die or find salvation. The young minister threw himself into circuit work with the fervor of a man seeking absolution. He rode between tiny settlements, preaching to congregations who had never seen an educated minister. His sermons burned with apocalyptic fire, speaking of hidden sins and divine judgment. It was in this state of missionary zeal that he received the letter that would change everything. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy who claimed to have found it tied to his saddle, without memory of how it got there. The paper was exceptional quality, thick and cream-colored with expensive watermarks. The handwriting was exquisite, each letter formed with careful precision. It was signed Mrs. Morwin Lawson and bore the address of Blackwood Flats, a place Thorne had never heard mentioned. The letter's contents were both simple and compelling. Mrs. Lawson wrote of her family's isolation, their desperate need for spiritual guidance, and most urgently, their young daughter Mercy, who lay gravely ill and required immediate baptism, lest her soul be claimed by darkness. "We have lived apart from Christian fellowship for too long," the letter continued in elegant script. Our daughter's condition grows dire, and we fear without proper baptism, her immortal soul may be forfeit. We have heard of your reputation as a man of unwavering faith. We beg you to come before it is too late." The letter closed with detailed directions to Blackwood Flats and payment that far exceeded anything Thorne had received. More important was the opportunity it represented. Here was a chance to save an innocent child's soul, to bring the gospel to a family that had languished in spiritual darkness. Thorne spent the night in prayer, wrestling with doubts he attributed to weakness rather than divine warning. The letter troubled him in ways he could not articulate, but when dawn came, his course was clear. God had delivered this opportunity, and he would be a fool to reject it. He gathered his possessions, saddled his horse, and set out with absolute certainty. The directions proved surprisingly precise, leading him along forgotten trails that seemed to twist until he lost all sense of direction. The deeper he rode, the more profound the silence became. Birds fell quiet, insects ceased buzzing, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By the time he reached Devil's Throat, Thorne felt as though he had left the known world entirely behind. He expected a family hungry for salvation. What he found was a family whose hunger was of a much more primal nature. Reverend Thorne's first glimpse of the Lawson compound defied every expectation. Where he had anticipated a rough frontier homestead, he found a settlement that rivaled the finest plantations. The main house rose from the valley floor like a monument to prosperity, its limestone walls gleaming pale in filtered light. But it was what Thorne did not see that first troubled him. There were no fields, no crops, no vegetable gardens. For a family living in such isolation, the absence of agriculture made no sense. How did they feed the dozen or more people he glimpsed moving between buildings? Morwen Lawson met him at the door with a curtsy that belonged in a European court, her pale hands folded with perfect grace. She was even more beautiful than he had imagined, possessed of an ethereal quality that made her seem almost translucent. Yet something in her manner made him think of porcelain dolls, lovely but lifeless. The interior continued the theme of inexplicable luxury. Persian rugs covered polished floors, oil paintings adorned walls, and furniture that must have cost fortunes filled every room. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows, their light reflecting off silver and fine china. As Morwen led him through the house, Thorne caught glimpses of the people she called servants. They moved with mechanical precision, their faces bearing vacant contentment that reminded him of cattle in pasture. All were well fed to plumpness, their skin pale from lives spent indoors, their features sharing disturbing family resemblance. The evening meal provided Thorne's first real glimpse into the family's operations. The dining table groaned under dishes that would have impressed guests in New Orleans hotels. Roasted meats of every variety, rich stews filling the air with savory aromas, delicate pastries that spoke of professional skills. Hezekiah Lawson presided with quiet authority of a patriarch who had never been questioned. His pale eyes missed nothing as they moved from guest to family to servants who glided between table and kitchen with ghostly efficiency. "We live simply here," he said during rare discourse, his voice carrying like winter wind. "We consume only what we raise ourselves, take only what the land provides, waste nothing that God has granted us." He carved another slice from the roast, his knife moving with practiced anatomical skill. Waste, Reverend Thorne, is the greatest sin of modern civilization. Caleb said nothing throughout the meal. His massive frame hunched as he consumed portions that would have fed 3 men. But his pale eyes never left their guest, studying Thorne with predatory intensity. Morwen proved most unsettling. She ate delicately, but Thorne noticed her plate contained only meat, no vegetables or bread. When she smiled, which she did often, her teeth seemed unnaturally white and sharp in candlelight. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. Hit that notification bell because what I'm about to reveal gets darker with each passing moment. That night, Listening to the constant water wheel grinding and soft movements from deep within the house, Thorne tried to reconcile what he had observed with frontier life. The family's wealth remained unexplained. Their servants' uniformity defied natural explanation. Most troubling was the sensation that he was not a guest, but something being evaluated, measured, perhaps prepared. The pieces didn't fit, and a dreadful picture began to form in the Reverend's mind, a picture confirmed one night when he stumbled upon the family's true ledger. By his third day in Blackwood Flats, Reverend Thorne could no longer ignore the wrongness that permeated the Lawson household. The promised meeting with young Mercy had been postponed repeatedly, while Thorne found himself growing desperate for answers to questions he dared not voice aloud. The servants moved with mechanical precision, but Thorne had begun to notice something disturbing about their behavior. They never spoke to each other, never made eye contact, never displayed any casual human interactions. They existed in profound isolation despite their proximity, as if carefully trained to ignore each other's existence. More troubling was their apparent abundance. In a region where families struggled to survive winter, the Lawson servants appeared uniformly well-nourished to the point of plumpness. Their skin held the pale, soft quality of people who had never known hardship, yet their eyes carried the vacant stare of livestock awaiting slaughter. This observation led Thorne to seek out the one person who might provide answers, the man Morwen had introduced as their foreman, Abner Lee. Unlike the other servants, Lee showed signs of age and wear, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who had seen too much. Most importantly, he was the only one Thorne had observed giving direction to others, suggesting authority within the household's strange hierarchy. Thorne found his opportunity on a fog-shrouded morning when the family had retreated indoors. Lee was tending equipment in a shed behind the tannery, cleaning and arranging tools that seemed far too specialized for simple leather work. The instruments looked more suited to a surgeon's table than a craftsman's workshop. "Mr. Lee," Thorne began carefully, stepping into the shadows. "Might I have a word?" The older man startled, nearly dropping the curved blade he had been sharpening. His eyes darted toward the main house before settling on Thorne with naked terror. "Reverend shouldn't be here," Lee whispered, his voice carrying the broken quality of someone who had learned to speak only in hushed tones. "Master don't like the help talking to guests, especially not about—" He trailed off, eyes returning to the blade. "About what, Mr. Lee?" Thorne pressed, moving closer despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "I'm here as a man of God, but I can't help what I don't understand." Lee's hands began to shake. "You don't want to understand, Reverend. Best thing you can do is baptize the child and leave this place. Don't ask questions. Don't look too close at nothing." But desperation had made Thorne bold. "I can't leave without knowing the truth. These people you work with, where do they come from? Why do they all look so similar? And why are there so many in a place that grows no food?" The question hung between them like a physical presence. Lee's shoulders sagged as if a great weight had settled upon them, and when he looked up, his eyes held the broken resignation of a man who had carried an unbearable secret for far too long. "They don't come from nowhere, Reverend," Lee said finally, his voice barely audible above the distant water wheel. "They're raised here, born here, been here their whole lives, just like their parents before them. Master Hezekiah, he's got very particular ideas about bloodlines, about keeping things pure." Thorne felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Lee set down the blade with trembling fingers. "He breeds them, Reverend, like you'd breed cattle or hogs. Keeps the best stock, culls the weak ones. Says it's the old way, the proper way. Says it purifies the blood, makes them more suitable for their purpose." "Their purpose?" "The harvest," Lee whispered, and the word echoed like a death knell. "Master says they're blessed, that their sacrifice sanctifies the family line. Says every great bloodline needs proper nourishment to maintain its strength." He looked directly at Thorne then, his eyes holding depths of horror no human should carry. He don't see it as evil, Reverend. He sees it as natural, as necessary. Thorne's knees nearly buckled. You're telling me they— Meat is meat, Reverend, Lee said, with the dead tone of someone reciting a lesson learned through repetition. Family is family, and business is business. That's what Master Hezekiah says. He touched his throat, and Thorne noticed for the first time the thin white scar running from ear to ear. Doubters don't last long in Blackwood Flats. Lee grabbed Thorne's arm with surprising strength. You got to promise me you won't tell them I spoke to you. They'll know if you act different. They watch everything, hear everything. Just do what you came for and leave, Reverend, please. With awful truth confirmed, Thorne knew he had to act. But first, he needed proof that would convince the outside world. And that proof was locked in Hezekiah's study. The next 2 days passed in an agony of forced normalcy. Thorne attended meals with the family, made polite conversation, and tried to suppress the nausea that rose every time he looked at the abundant platters of meat. Hezekiah spoke about the purity of bloodlines and the sacred nature of sacrifice, all while carving roasts with surgical precision. Morwen continued her performance as the gracious hostess, but Thorne now noticed how her pale eyes lingered on him, studying him with the calculating interest a chef might show when selecting ingredients. Caleb remained silent, his massive presence filling every room like a promise of violence barely held in check. On his 5th night in Blackwood Flats, Thorne made his decision. He waited until the house settled into its peculiar quiet, broken only by the constant grinding of the water wheel. By midnight, even the servants had disappeared into whatever quarters housed them during their rest. Thorne crept from his room with careful steps, understanding that discovery meant death. His bare feet made no sound on the polished floors as he navigated darkened hallways, guided by faint moonlight. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. Every whisper of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. Hezekiah's study occupied the rear corner of the house, secured with an expensive eastern lock. But Thorne's childhood in the St. Louis slums had taught him skills that seminary never addressed. The lock yielded to his ministrations with barely a whisper. The study's interior revealed Hezekiah's true nature. The walls were lined with books bearing titles in unidentifiable languages, their leather bindings stained with organic substances. Charts depicting human anatomy covered the remaining space, marked with notations about yield and quality that made Thorne's stomach turn. But the desk held what he sought. A massive ledger bound in what appeared to be human skin lay open beneath a magnifying glass, filled with entries in Hezekiah's precise handwriting. Thorne lit a candle with trembling fingers and began to read. The entries stretched back 14 years, beginning with the family's arrival. Names filled column after column, each accompanied by dates of birth, physical descriptions, and breeding compatibility notations. Cross-references showed careful planning to maintain genetic diversity, while other entries tracked the systematic harvesting of mature specimens. The ledger read like a farmer's livestock records, but the names were human. The descriptions spoke of people, and the harvest dates marked the end of lives. Thorne found entries for children born in the valley who had never seen the outside world, raised from birth to fulfill their predetermined role. Most chilling were the philosophical notations scattered throughout. Hezekiah had documented his beliefs about the purifying effects of consuming human flesh, the spiritual benefits of complete dominion over other humans, and the divine nature of his calling. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a pioneer returning to humanity's most ancient traditions. As Thorne read deeper, his hands began shaking so violently that candlelight danced across the pages. Here was proof beyond doubt, documentation that would expose the Lawson's crimes and bring justice to the forgotten victims whose names filled these terrible pages. The sound of a creaking floorboard froze his blood. Thorne looked up to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking escape. The giant's pale eyes reflected candlelight like a predator's, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Neither man moved. Then Caleb smiled, revealing teeth filed to sharp points, and stepped into the room. What followed was desperate flight for survival. Thorne grabbed the ledger and threw himself through the study's window in an explosion of glass and splintered wood. He hit the ground hard, feeling something in his shoulder give way, but adrenaline carried him to his feet and sent him stumbling toward the tree line. Behind him, the house erupted into activity. Lights blazed in every window, voices shouted, and running feet echoed across the valley. Thorne crashed through undergrowth like a wounded animal, clutching the ledger as branches tore at his nightclothes and roots sent him sprawling. The pursuit followed him into the woods, guided by torchlight and baying hounds that sounded more like wolves than dogs. But desperation gave Thorne speed and cunning he had never possessed. He used every childhood trick of hide and seek, doubling back on his trail, wading through streams to confuse the scent. Dawn found him at the rim of Devil's Throat, bloodied and exhausted but alive. The ledger remained clutched in his good hand, its pages damp with dew and stained with blood but still legible. Behind him, Blackwood Flats lay shrouded in morning mist, giving no sign of its horrors. He made it to Gaspar's Landing, clutching the ledger like a bomb, ready to expose the monsters of Blackwood Flats to the world. Sheriff Josiah Hale looked up from his morning coffee to find Reverend Thorne standing in his doorway like an apparition from hell. The young minister's clothes hung in tatters. His face bore scratches and bruises from miles of hostile wilderness, and his eyes held the wild gleam of someone who had witnessed horrors beyond comprehension. But it was what Thorne clutched that made Hale's blood run cold. The ledger was bound in leather that looked disturbingly organic, its pages yellowed with age and stained with substances the sheriff preferred not to identify. "Sheriff," Thorne gasped, his voice hoarse from terror. "The Lawson family, they're monsters, cannibals. They've been breeding people like livestock for over a decade." Hale had been sheriff long enough to recognize madness, but something in Thorne's manner gave him pause. There was the ledger, sitting on his desk like a coiled snake, demanding examination. With growing unease, Hale opened the book. What he found made his hands shake. The entries were written in precise, educated handwriting, each line carefully crafted and methodically organized. This was not ravings, but careful record-keeping of systematic horror. The first entries dated back to 1858, shortly after the Lawson family's arrival. Names filled columns in neat rows, each accompanied by detailed information that made Hale's stomach turn. Birth dates, physical descriptions, lineage charts that tracked bloodlines with the care a horse breeder might use for prize stallions. But the additional notations revealed the true purpose. Beside each name were cryptic symbols and dates that tracked systematic elimination of the people listed. Some entries bore harvest complete, followed by detailed descriptions of yield and quality. Others were marked with breeding assignments, pairing individuals based on genetic compatibility rather than human choice. "Look at this," Thorne whispered, pointing to a section. "Sarah McKinnon, born 1842, noted as prime breeding stock until 1867, then marked for final harvest. Her children are listed below, tracked from birth to..." He couldn't finish, but the implications were clear. Hale studied the dates with a lawman's eye for criminal patterns. The harvests followed careful schedules, with younger individuals reserved for breeding, while older ones were selected based on calculations of nutritional value and meat quality. Cross-referencing revealed a population that had remained remarkably stable. For every person marked for harvest, new births were documented, maintaining overall numbers while allowing selective breeding that gradually improved the stock according to Hezekiah's twisted standards. "My God," Hale breathed, running his finger down columns tracking the systematic elimination of entire family lines. "This isn't random killing, it's agriculture. They're farming people." The ledger contained detailed records of feeding schedules, medical care, and living conditions that read like livestock management manuals. The captive population was kept healthy not from mercy, but to ensure optimal meat quality. Children were separated from parents at weaning age and raised to produce docile adults who would accept their fate without resistance. Most disturbing were philosophical entries scattered throughout. Hezekiah had documented his beliefs about spiritual and physical benefits of consuming human flesh, particularly from carefully bred stock never contaminated by the outside world. He wrote extensively about bloodline purity, claiming his family's consumption had elevated them above ordinary humanity. He calls it the sacred feast, Thorne said, pointing to a chilling passage. Claims it's mankind's original state of grace. He believes they're doing God's work by maintaining the old ways. Hale studied financial notations with growing comprehension. The ledger revealed how systematic cannibalism had generated substantial wealth through careful resource management. Nothing was wasted, with every part put to profitable use through the tannery operation that served as front for their true business. The sheriff's own ledger, locked in his desk drawer, told a complimentary story of regular payments from H. Lawson marked "Services Rendered." Now those payments took on sinister meaning, representing the price of official blindness to Blackwood Flats horrors. "This is enough," Hale said finally, closing the ledger with shaking hands. "Evidence enough to hang them all if we can find them still alive." He looked at Thorne, seeing the same desperate need for justice building in his own chest. For 15 years he had taken Lawson money and turned away, telling himself their activities weren't his concern. Now, faced with documented proof, he could no longer maintain comfortable ignorance. "Can you lead a posse back to Blackwood Flats?" Hale asked, reaching for his gun belt. Thorne nodded, though his face paled at the thought of returning. "Yes, but after last night they'll be expecting trouble. They might have fled or prepared defenses." "Then we'd better move fast," Hale replied, checking his revolver's chambers. The evidence was all there in cold, meticulous script. It was time to return to Blackwood Flats and bring the Lawson family to justice. Sheriff Hale's posse assembled at dawn like a gathering storm. 12 grim-faced men who had heard enough, whispered rumors to suspect whatever they found would haunt their dreams forever. Most were war veterans who had seen humanity's worst on battlefields, yet none felt prepared for what awaited them. The ride to Devil's Throat passed in oppressive silence, broken only by creaking leather and dull hoofbeats. Even the horses seemed to sense wrongness ahead, their ears flattened, nostrils flaring at scents of predators and death. As they climbed higher, normal forest sounds faded until they rode through landscape as silent as a graveyard. The descent into Blackwood Flats revealed a scene that defied expectations. Where they had anticipated finding a fortress or smoking ruins, they discovered instead a settlement that appeared utterly normal. Smoke rose from chimneys, the water wheel turned with mechanical rhythm, and chickens pecked contentedly behind the main house. The very normalcy made it profoundly unsettling. After the horrors documented in Hezekiah's ledger, they had braced for obvious signs of evil. Instead, they found domestic tranquility that seemed to mock their suspicions. "Something's wrong," muttered Deputy Morrison. "Place is too quiet, too perfect, like a stage set waiting for actors." They approached with weapons drawn, scanning windows for movement. But the building remained still as a tomb, its dark windows reflecting nothing but their tense faces. Sheriff Hale pounded on the door, the sound echoing like gunshots. "Hezekiah Lawson, this is Sheriff Hale. Open this door in the name of the law." The silence that followed seemed to press against their eardrums. After long minutes, they forced the door with a rifle butt. The interior revealed the first signs something was terribly wrong. The rooms were immaculate, every piece of furniture in place, but completely empty of human presence. Plates on the dining table still bore remnants of interrupted meals, but the food had gone cold hours ago. Room by room, they searched the house, finding evidence of hasty but organized departure. Closets stood empty, drawers cleared of belongings, the safe gaped open with contents removed, yet nothing appeared taken in panic. This had been methodical evacuation, planned and executed with precision. The kitchen told a more disturbing story. Massive stoves were cold, but larders that had once groaned with mysterious meats now stood scrubbed clean. Every surface gleamed with thorough cleaning that suggested removing not just dirt, but evidence. Strong lye soap hung in the air, unable to completely mask lingering odors of rendering and butchery. Behind the main house, the tannery presented an even more unsettling sight. The water wheel continued endless rotation, but machinery had been thoroughly dismantled and cleaned. Vats were empty and spotless. Work tables were bare as surgical surfaces. In the quarters behind the tannery, they made their most disturbing discovery. 24 men, women, and children stood in perfect rows like soldiers awaiting inspection, faces bearing vacant expressions. But these were not terrified survivors they expected to rescue. Instead, they seemed confused and directionless, like sheep whose shepherd had vanished. "Where is the Lawson family?" Hale demanded, but received only blank stares. The question seemed incomprehensible to minds that had been systematically broken. Deputy Morrison found evidence of escape in limestone caves beneath the compound. Passages that had once stored preserved meats now stood empty, walls bearing marks of recent traffic. Tracks suggested the entire family had disappeared into underground networks connecting similar caves throughout the Ozarks. As sunset fell, Hale found himself contemplating the coroner's report he would file. The official record would state no evidence of criminal activity had been found, that the family had simply relocated, leaving behind former employees who claimed no knowledge of wrongdoing. The Lawsons had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a perfect empty shell, and the only proof of Thorne's story was a ledger that now seemed to tell a very different tale. In the weeks following the raid on Blackwood Flats, Reverend Thorne found himself haunted not just by what he had witnessed, but by what he was beginning to suspect he had misunderstood. The ledger that had seemed so damning now lay on Sheriff Hale's desk, its pages revealing secrets somehow both less monstrous and more disturbing than either man had initially comprehended. It was Deputy Morrison who first voiced the doubts gnawing at them all. A practical man with a head for numbers, he had been studying the ledger's entries with methodical attention, trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit properly. "Sheriff," he said one gray morning, spreading the ledger across Hale's desk, "I've been going through these records again, and something don't add up the way we thought." "What do you mean?" Hale asked. "Look at these terms here," Morrison said, pointing to entries that had initially seemed to document cannibalism. "Stock, yield, prime cut, harvest. We read them one way, thinking about what the preacher told us. But what if we've been looking at this all wrong?" The sheriff moved closer, studying pages with fresh eyes. The entries were still chilling in their clinical detachment, still spoke of human beings treated as inventory. But Morrison was right. There was another way to interpret the language that made different, horrible sense. "Think about it," Morrison continued. "The Lawsons ran a tannery, right? Big operation, processing hides and leather goods. What if these terms ain't about eating people? What if they're about something else entirely?" Hale felt cold realization forming. "You're suggesting the harvest was the sale of people, Sheriff, not for meat but for labor. All those entries about prime cuts and quality yield. What if that's tannery talk? Grading people the same way you'd grade cattle, but not for the dinner table, for the auction block." The implications hit Hale like a physical blow. He grabbed the ledger and began flipping through pages with new understanding, seeing patterns hidden by their initial assumption. The careful breeding program took on different meaning when viewed through the lens of human trafficking rather than consumption. The isolated population had indeed been bred like livestock, but for labor value rather than meat. The harvest entries corresponded not to systematic murder, but to the sale of human beings to buyers who valued strong backs and docile temperaments over freedom. "Look at these financial records," Morrison said, pointing to previously overlooked columns. Regular payments from buyers across 3 states, cotton plantations in Mississippi, lumber operations in Louisiana, mining concerns in Colorado, all paying premium prices for specialty stock. The term specialty stock took on sinister new meaning. The Lawsons had been breeding people not just for physical strength, but for psychological compliance. The vacant expressions and mechanical obedience Thorne had observed were not terror, but systematic conditioning beginning in infancy. The inbreeding served practical purpose in this interpretation. By maintaining a closed population and controlling reproduction, the Lawsons had created a workforce psychologically incapable of rebellion or escape. They were living tools, shaped and molded for specific purposes. The well-fed appearance, Hale muttered, pieces falling into place. They weren't being fattened for slaughter. They were being maintained as valuable property. Healthy slaves sell for more than sick ones. Morrison nodded grimly. And the timing. This operation started right around the war's end, when official slave trade was being shut down. The Lawsons found a way to continue using indentured servitude laws as cover. The sheriff's own ledger, with its record of payments from H. Lawson marked services and discretion, took on new significance. He had not been covering up cannibalism, but enabling human trafficking on massive scale under the protection of purchased law enforcement. The folk songs and whispered stories suddenly made different sense. Tales of cannibalism and supernatural horror served as perfect camouflage for the more mundane evil of systematic human bondage. Who would investigate obvious superstition seriously enough to discover truth? The cannibal story was a cover-up, Hale said slowly. Not to hide what they were doing from us, but to hide what we were allowing them to do from everyone else. The truth was monstrous enough, but it lacked sensational quality that made memorable folklore. Systematic human trafficking was depressingly common after the Civil War. A family that bred and sold humans was evil, but not uniquely so. A family that ate humans was nightmare material and cautionary tales. The ledger's final entries, dated just before Thorne's arrival, suggested the family had been planning departure for some time. The final harvest was actually the sale of remaining stock to buyers who could transport them far from Arkansas before investigation could uncover truth. Hale closed the ledger with shaking hands, not from fear but shame. The real horror was not that the Lawsons had been monsters, but that they had been all too human in their cruelty and greed. And he had enabled their crimes through willful blindness and purchased silence. The truth was monstrous enough, more so because it was believable, systematic, and preventable. But if that was the case, then why had the cannibal story not only persisted, but grown stronger with each telling? The official investigation into the Lawson family concluded with bureaucratic efficiency that spoke more to expediency than justice. Within 2 weeks of the raid, Sheriff Hale filed his final report, a document so sanitized it bore little resemblance to the horrors documented in Hezekiah's ledger. According to official records, the Lawson family had simply relocated to parts unknown, taking their legitimate business interests with them. The people found in the compound were described as former employees, recently freed from contractual obligations and now seeking work elsewhere. No mention was made of breeding programs, systematic conditioning, or human trafficking. The ledger itself disappeared into Hale's private files, too dangerous for public consumption. Reverend Thorne found himself caught in institutional silence, stretching from county courthouse to state capitol. His reports of cannibalism were quietly dismissed as ravings of a man whose grip on reality had been loosened by isolation and stress. When he persisted, suggesting the truth was even worse than his original claims, he was gently but firmly encouraged to seek a new calling in a different state. The Presbyterian hierarchy, already embarrassed by Thorne's previous St. Louis scandal, saw his Arkansas adventure as confirmation of their worst fears about his mental stability. Within a month of returning from Blackwood Flats, he found himself stripped of ministerial credentials and advised to pursue secular employment far from any pulpit. The people rescued from the compound faced an even more tragic fate. With no legal identity, no family connections outside the valley, and no skills beyond basic labor, They were scattered like leaves before a storm. Some were quietly absorbed into existing communities, their strange mannerisms attributed to mountain hardships. Others simply vanished, perhaps falling victim to the same forces that had originally brought them to Blackwood Flats. None were ever interviewed by investigators. None were asked to testify about their experiences. None were offered assistance in rebuilding lives they had never truly owned. They were treated not as victims deserving justice, but as inconvenient reminders of crimes too complex and embarrassing to prosecute properly. Mrs. Ray's Agnes Pettigrew, the postmistress who had collected stories about the Lawsons, found herself visited by men in expensive suits who suggested certain tales were better left untold. Her collection of folklore and gossip mysteriously disappeared from her home one night, along with any correspondence that might have connected the Lawsons to buyers in other states. The physical evidence suffered similar fate. The compound was sold at auction to buyers claiming to represent Eastern lumber interests. Within 6 months, the entire settlement had been systematically dismantled, its buildings torn down and foundations buried under tons of earth. The limestone caves were sealed with dynamite, officially to prevent accidents but effectively erasing any trace of the underground network. Even local folklore began to change, shaped by invisible but powerful forces. Stories that had once whispered of human trafficking gradually transformed into tales of supernatural horror and cannibalistic appetite. The more believable crimes were replaced by legends so fantastic that no rational person would investigate them seriously. Sheriff Hale retired early, citing health problems everyone understood, but no one discussed. His replacement was a younger man from outside the county, someone with no knowledge of local history and no interest in pursuing cold cases that might prove embarrassing. The new sheriff's first act was destroying several boxes of documents as part of routine records cleanup. The conspiracy of silence was so complete that within 5 years most people had forgotten the Lawson family had ever existed. Those who remembered were either dead, discredited, or too frightened to speak. The few who possessed actual knowledge learned to keep it to themselves, understanding that some truths were too dangerous to share. But in the hills and hollows where memory runs deeper than official records, where stories are passed down through generations like precious heirlooms, a different kind of preservation was taking place. The official record had been closed, sealed, and buried, but in dark corners where people gathered to share forbidden knowledge, a different story was being kept alive. Today, more than 150 years after the Lawsons vanished into the Arkansas wilderness, their story continues to evolve in ways that would have both horrified and amused Hezekiah himself. The internet age has breathed new life into old legends, transforming whispered folklore into viral content that reaches audiences the original conspirators could never have imagined. True crime podcasters have discovered the Lawson case with the enthusiasm of prospectors striking gold. They dissect the few surviving documents with forensic precision, debate various theories, and invariably conclude that the truth lies somewhere between official silence and fantastic folklore. But even these modern investigators find themselves frustrated by the systematic erasure of evidence that occurred after the Blackwood Flats raid. Hikers exploring remote regions of the Arkansas Ozarks occasionally stumble upon stone foundations buried beneath decades of forest growth. These discoveries generate brief flurries of excitement on social media, accompanied by photographs of moss-covered limestone blocks and speculation about their origins. But coordinates are rarely shared publicly, and follow-up expeditions often find that sites have been somehow obscured or destroyed. The folk song that Mrs. Pettigrew once collected, the Lawson Larder, has found unexpected new life in the digital age. Modern musicians have discovered the haunting melody and cryptic lyrics, creating recordings that climb streaming charts and introduce new generations to the legend. But the song's meaning remains elusive. Its references to flesh on the hill and a hunger no pig can fill, interpreted differently by each listener. Academic researchers have attempted to trace the historical record, but they encounter the same wall of institutional silence that frustrated 19th century investigators. University archives contain tantalizing fragments, references to the Arkansas incident in private correspondence, mentions of population irregularities in census reports, but nothing substantial enough to build a definitive case. Modern genealogists searching for connections to the mysterious people found in Blackwood Flats have discovered frustrating gaps in the historical record. DNA testing companies occasionally report unusual clusters of genetic similarity in certain regions, patterns suggesting isolated populations that remained separate from surrounding communities for extended periods. But these scientific breadcrumbs lead nowhere definitive. Perhaps most disturbing are occasional reports that filter through law enforcement networks. Cases bearing similarities to what allegedly occurred in Blackwood Flats. Missing persons cases involving multiple family members who vanish without trace. Human trafficking operations displaying levels of organization that suggest generational knowledge and experience. These modern cases are quickly buried beneath layers of bureaucratic silence that would have been familiar to Sheriff Hale. Official explanations are provided, files are sealed, and witnesses who speak publicly are discredited or intimidated into silence. The methods have been refined, but the underlying pattern remains consistent. The question haunting modern researchers is not whether the Lawson family existed, but whether they truly disappeared. The systematic nature of their operation, the careful planning evident in their escape, and ongoing efforts to suppress information all suggest an organization too sophisticated to simply vanish without leaving successors. The story endures because it asks a question we are still afraid to answer, which is more terrifying, a monster that eats men, or a man who treats other men as meat. In the end, what can we say with certainty about the Lawson family of Blackwood Flats? The official record offers us nothing but carefully constructed silence. The folklore gives us monsters too fantastic to believe, but between these extremes lies a truth that is perhaps more terrifying than either version because it is so fundamentally, recognizably human. The Blackwood Ledger exists. Whatever interpretation we place upon its entries, the document itself stands as undeniable proof that something monstrous occurred in that forgotten valley between 1858 and 1872. The careful handwriting, the systematic record-keeping, the clinical detachment with which human lives were catalogued and processed, all speak to crimes that were not committed in passion or madness, but with the cold calculation of a business enterprise. Whether those crimes involved cannibalism or human trafficking may ultimately matter less than the fact that they involved the complete dehumanization of vulnerable people who had no voice, no protection, and no hope of rescue. The Lawsons, regardless of their specific appetites, created a system that treated human beings as inventory to be managed, processed, and consumed according to the demands of profit and power. The conspiracy of silence that followed their disappearance reveals something equally disturbing about the society that should have protected their victims. From local law enforcement to state officials to religious hierarchies, every institution that encountered evidence of the Lawsons' crimes chose expediency over justice. They found it easier to bury the truth than to confront the uncomfortable questions it raised about complicity, negligence, and moral failure. This pattern of institutional protection continues to this day. The systematic suppression of information, the discrediting of witnesses, the destruction of physical evidence, all demonstrate that the forces which enabled the Lawsons' crimes have not disappeared with the passage of time. They have merely become more sophisticated in their methods and more efficient in their application. The folk song that transformed systematic human bondage into supernatural horror serves as a perfect metaphor for how societies process unbearable truths. We prefer our monsters to be obviously monstrous, clearly alien, safely relegated to the realm of fantasy. The idea that ordinary-looking people in ordinary-looking houses might be capable of extraordinary evil challenges our fundamental assumptions about human nature and social order. The people of Blackwood Flats were consumed, not by teeth, but by greed, a hunger that history has never struggled to believe. Their tragedy was not that they fell victim to unique monsters, but that they encountered the most common predators of all, those who see other human beings as resources to be exploited rather than souls to be cherished. If you found this investigation disturbing, subscribe to ensure you don't miss our continued exploration into the crimes history prefers to forget. Because in the end, the most important question is not what happened in that remote valley over a century ago, but what might be happening in forgotten places today, protected by the same walls of silence that once shielded the Lawson family from justice. Hit that notification bell, because the darkness we refuse to acknowledge is the darkness that continues to thrive.